So good day, everyone, and welcome to this closing plenary session of the Regions in Recovery Global E-Festival. I'm Danny MacKinnon. I'm a professor in the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University, and it's my privilege to be chairing this closing panel. So the Regions in Recovery, this is the second Regions in Recovery Global E-Festival organized by the Regional Studies Association. It's been running over the past 2 weeks with sessions most days since the 21st of March, and this is the last session and closing plenary of the E-Festival. So just a couple of bits of housekeeping. Please keep your mics muted at all times unless called by the chair to speak. This meeting will be recorded and made available on the RSA Hub after the event. If you wish to stay private, obviously, please keep your video turned off and don't unmute yourselves. And to ask questions, either put them in the chat using a queue for question in front of it, but you can also use the raise hand function in the discussion part of the session and wait to be called by the chair and then unmute and ask the question. So the theme of this closing plenary session is the new state capitalism, which is kind of a broad theme that's really been emerging in the literature, the academic literature, and also some of the business and news media over the past few years. In the business and news media, it's often referred to as the return of the state or a new interventionism. So the idea that after a period in which the state seemed to be largely in contraction or retreat in the 80s and 1990s into the 2000s, that the state has kind of been expanding in some ways since the global financial crisis. So this session is really designed to discuss this proposition of capitalism, expansion of the state, and explore its implications in a regional, subnational context, this being our Regions in Recovery Festival. So we have three very distinguished speakers on our panel today. So our first speaker will be Adam Dixon, who's Associate Professor of Globalization and Development at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He's published a number of books, similar books on pension funds, business investment, new geography of capitalism, and sovereign wealth funds. And Adam's currently principal investigator of the research project Legitimacy, Financialization, and Varieties of Capitalism, Understanding Sovereign Wealth Funds in Europe, which is funded by the European Research Council. Our second speaker is Linda Labao, who is professor in rural sociology, sociology and geography at the Ohio State University in the US. The States, and her research focuses on spatial inequality and the impact of state and market changes on socioeconomic well-being across localities. In her recent research, she's been examining local governments across the US, the range of policies they implement, and how the local state influences the welfare of the population. Linda's co-editor of the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and past president of the Rural Sociological Society. Our third speaker is Dr. Kean van Lim, who's senior lecturer in economic geography at Newcastle University in the UK, and Kean's primarily interested in how the political economic evolution of Chinese city regions has been shaped by the distinctive kind of developmental state approach of the Chinese state. Kean's published 2 books on Chinese political economy, one in the prestigious Royal Geographical Society flagship book series, and multiple articles in major journals. Kean's currently working on 3 research projects. The first on the subnational constituents of Chinese economic statecraft, second on the politics of economic integration in Chinese border regions, and the third on the city regional effects of the EU-China Transcontinental Railway. So each of our 3 speakers will speak for around about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Adam. Adam, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, RSA, for inviting me. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you here. It's a pleasure to speak with you. Okay, so the title of my remarks today will be "The Specter of State Capitalism," and this is a title of a forthcoming book that I'm working on with my collaborator on most of this work that I've been doing, Ilyas Alami, who was a postdoc with me for 3 years and now is a Marie Curie Fellow at Uppsala. And so this work and my remarks very much reflect his input and his imprint, but I'd also like to thank Imogen Liu, a PhD student of mine, and Milan Babic, another former postdoc who has also been influential in helping me formulate my ideas around state capitalism. Just to give you some background, so we've written a number of papers. Today I'll speak mainly about a paper that was recently published in Environment and Planning A called Uneven and Combined State Capitalism. And this is part of a theme issue called Making Space for the New State Capitalism, which is co-edited by myself, along with Heather Whiteside, Ilyas Alami, and Jamie Peck. And you can also see recent papers in economic geography, political geography, contemporary politics, geopolitics, and competition and change. Unfortunately, all of these are open access, so please do go and look for them. This is also, as I mentioned, theoretical material for a forthcoming book that we're working on and hopefully securing a publisher soon. So as Danny mentioned in the opening remarks, we see a tangible return of the state. Now, to be sure, the state never left, but in material terms and on many quantitative measures, we see more state. So for example, as of 2020, we have more than 100 sovereign wealth funds, which is the topic that I focus on significantly and have done, and which my ERC project is based on. And this is a six-fold increase since 2000. So in the last 2 decades, we've seen them the numbers going from a very few to over 100, with assets, this is actually an underrepresentation, assets reaching $10 trillion from less than $1 trillion in 2000. So we see many more sovereign funds. We also see a remarkable revival of state-owned enterprises. Over the past decade, they've doubled in their importance in the among the world's largest 2,000 firms. And at $45 trillion, their assets are now equivalent to half of global GDP. And this is not, as you might expect, just a China phenomenon. We still see significant amounts of state-owned enterprises, even in the advanced capitalist economies. But in short, sovereign funds as investors and state-owned enterprises, they constitute a major force of transnationalizing capital. And they're actively participating in cross-border M&A, cross-listing of shares, international portfolio investment, and foreign direct investment. At the same time, we also see a return to fashion of national development banks and policy banks, again, in both advanced capitalist economies and in the global South. At the same time, at the policy level, we see a return of techno-industrial policy and national development strategies. Just as an anecdote, I was at the OECD a few years ago on a panel, and I was sitting next to Mario Pezzini, who used to be the director of the Development Center. And he said how excited he was that industrial policy as a word, as a concept, was something that he could speak again and we could talk about, because it had gone out the door and it was something you couldn't mention. But he was excited that it had come back into the lexicon. And again, I think everyone here will see that there's more and more embrace of industrial policy, even in the so-called very liberal or neoliberal economies like the United Kingdom or the United States. At the same time, across the countries, UNCTAD has shown that countries across the income spectrum have more explicit national industrial development policies. And in addition, we see trade wars, neo-mercantilism, economic nationalism, and as well, unconventional monetary policy and massive bailouts of the private sector, which happened again in the financial crisis, but increasingly so in the COVID-19 pandemic. And what this has done, as we've seen, and why we're interested and why we're talking about this, is because of this increase or rise of the state, we see state capitalism being used increasingly in the academic literature as a rubric or a label, if you will, to register the more visible role of the state in the economy and society. And as Danny mentioned in the initial remarks, the term state capitalism is also used in the business or even the kind of political world. Often it's labeled against China. But in any case, we see more interest across the social sciences. However, and this is where we started from 3.5 years ago when Ilias and I first began working on this, on state capitalism, as we realized that the nature and the implications of the phenomena in the academic literature was varied and an object of intense debate. In the literature, state capitalism has been referred to as used to refer to a vast array of political and institutional forms. So again, it's been used to discuss sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, national development banks, all the organizations that I mentioned in the last few slides, but also in terms of post-developmentalism, post-neoliberalism, capitalisms in emerging economies, such as China, Russia, Turkey, Indonesia, Singapore, and Hungary, as well as the renewal of industrial and neo-mercantilist policies, and many, many more. For us, however, it is unclear why any of these things taken individually would deserve the moniker of state capitalism. So why, if a country has a sovereign wealth fund, you would refer to it as state capitalist, though we see that in the literature. So unfortunately, the use of the term state capitalism often lacks analytical purchase. And there are already rigorous terms and bundles of concepts which have been specifically developed to study these various political and institutional forms, such that state capitalism as an analytical concept may not actually be that useful. However, we submit that the added value of the category state capitalism resides precisely in that it calls for an understanding of the recent upward trajectory of these various political and institutional forms together and in relation to each other in a co-constitutive movement. So for example, there's a developed literature on developmentalism or the developmental state, and it's useful in but it has its limits. But as it stands, we don't see that the developmental state, as one example, necessarily helps us explain this recent upward trajectory. Hence, we think state capitalism as a concept, as an analytical concept, but also as a topic of empirical reality is something that we could develop. And so for us, we use state capitalism as a flexible means of problematizing the aggregate expansion of the state's role as promoter, supervisor, and owner of capital across the spaces of the world capitalist economy. And this is characterized by, on the one hand, the multiplication of what we call state capital hybrids. And we just published a paper in economic geography that goes into more detail on what we mean by state capital hybrids and their organizational development. And these, again, are sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, and policy and development banks. And on the one hand, the co-constitutive expansion of development or the development of muscular forms of statism, so industrial policy, spatial development strategies, and economic nationalism. So it's the co-constitutive expansion of these across the world capitalist economy. Now, this leads us to ask a number of different questions. So why does state capitalism ascend? How does it ascend? Why now? With what implications, and how to explain it? How do we explain it? Its institutional and diversity. So in the literature, the main types of approaches see state capitalism as a national variety of capitalism, often coming from China or emerging economies, increasingly rivaling neoliberal market economies and transforming the liberal world. But there's various problems with this. These explanations are inappropriately scaled, so they belie a certain methodological nationalism, which most geographers would take issue with. I do certainly. They also have difficulties in accounting for the connections between various repertoires of state intervention. And they employ a narrative of a clash between rival political economic models. And this is limited. And there is little, at the same time, little reflection on the historic development of global capitalism, such as planetary mutations in the spheres of production, circulation, and distribution of the value. In other words, they can't make sense of the world capitalist economy. And as we know, if you read your Marx, capitalism is world making, if you like. Rather than the rise of a new state-led national model of capitalism, which allegedly competes with alongside free market capitalism, we see the expansion of state capitalism as a process of state restructuring, which must be grasped as a moment of the global dynamics of capital accumulation. State capitalism not as an anomaly or a deviance from liberal market-based capitalism, such as China versus the United States, but as a particular, we see it as a particular modality of expression of the capitalist state. And I should also mention that we see the capitalist state and state capitalism operating at different levels of theoretical abstraction, where the capitalist state is prior to state capitalism. We see state capitalism as an imminent potentiality, an impulse, which is contained in the form of the capitalist state and built into its DNA. The contemporary advent of state capitalism must be located within a set of processes pertaining to the historical development and geographical remaking of global capitalism. And we draw in this paper attention to two secular capitalist transformations. And I'll go through these very quickly, and then I'll stop because I think I've ran out of time already. Excuse me. So you can see from here, so these two, so we see the driver of state capitalism now being driven by two different phenomena. On the one hand, automation, robotization, and digitalization of large-scale industries, which has allowed or led to, or the secular capitalist transformations and the geographical manifestations of this has been a deepening of the new international division of labor, new global pattern of extraction, production, and consumption, and a shift in the center of gravity of the global economy from the North Atlantic to the Pacific. The other secular capitalist transformation is what we would see as the secular stagnation and the worsening of chronic situation of industrial overcapacity in the 2000s and 2010s, which geographically manifests in global markets being saturated, an intensification of international concentration, competition, and concentration and centralization of capital. And for us, state capitalism comes as the process of political mediation by the state and associated state restructuring to take account of these transformations in the material forms of relative surplus value production on a world scale. And this leads to, and I won't have time to go into them, but what we see as four different types of state capitalist impulses: productivist, absorptive, stabilizing, and disciplinary. I don't have time to go into them, but the paper does in more detail. So just by way of conclusion, I'll skip over this because this just sums what I've just said, but the implications of our approach is that it allows, it moves us away from talking about rivalry between particular economies and allows us to understand this process globally. And the geopolitical repercussions of state capitalism, we would say, is it's unlikely to lead to patterns of institutional convergence or divergence, which have been a central lens in the state capitalism studies and in discussions of changing world orders. But we do see that state capitalism may well beget more state capitalism. But the future of the global political economy will not be one where a model has prevailed over another. This future we see as more likely to be characterized by a sort of polycentric restructuring of the global landscapes of state capitalism, catalyzed by the cumulative unfolding of more muscular state prerogatives across the world capitalist economies. And I'm happy to answer questions later in the Q&A to discuss this further. And thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Adam. That was a great overview and kind of explanation and unpacking of the main dimensions of state capitalism and your particular understanding of it and approach to it. We'll move straight on to the next speaker now, who is Linda Labao. So Linda, the floor is all yours.
Okay, so this presentation is part of a new project that I'm doing with a group of researchers in the UK, Ron Martin, Mia Gray, and Mike Kitson, and we're editing a special issue of the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society on the state in the post-COVID crisis. So this sort of comes out of that. And again, I really appreciate being invited by the RSA, and thanks to Sally Hardy and Katharina and Danny also for his introduction into the other speakers. So I just want to focus briefly today on two issues. So my focus, whereas Adam's focus was more on the sphere of economic development, I'm looking more at social reproduction in terms of what the US state did in the COVID crisis. So I'm going to speak very briefly about an overview of the US state's response to the COVID crisis, and then to evaluate, to what degree has it been a break with the past? So to sort of set the context, the US is a fragmented federal state a system, and it's polarized politically with a historically weak welfare state. The characteristics of the US state then made it particularly vulnerable to, it makes it particularly vulnerable to pandemics. So something we're going to have to deal with in the future. Nevertheless, the response to the COVID-19 crisis has been called unprecedented in speed and magnitude. A few weeks after the pandemic hit, our US Congress launched the largest economic relief package in US history. And in calendar year alone, in 2020, we spent more than twice as much as was spent on trying to pick up from the fallout of the Great Recession. Moody's has got a great, if you're interested in this at all, and this is actually some global information here, but Moody's has got a new analytical report. Moody's Analytical has a new report out looking at how different nations responded to the COVID crisis. And Moody's notes that no other nation responded more aggressively to the pandemic than the United States. In total, the fiscal support was well over $5 trillion, equal to nearly 25% of the GDP. Trump and Biden had somewhat different policy packages, but they both involved some new financial instruments such as stimulus or direct payments to businesses and to individuals, as well as making up for shortfalls in other social programs that we had already had, like Medicaid and unemployment insurance. So the programs did have an effect, and it showed that the U.S. state matters, challenging the view of an ineffective, counterproductive state, which is basically rampant, I would say, today in the United States. For example, in terms of the effect of these programs, the supplementary poverty rate declined, and this is not the official poverty rate, but it's a supplementary. It's a rate that includes income transfers. Also takes into consideration cost of housing. So it varies. It's interesting because it varies by rural and urban areas differently than the regular poverty rate would, the official poverty rate. So the supplemental poverty rate declined to its lowest level in 2020 to 9.1% of the population. Moody's estimates that without all of the aid that was given to the US economy, real GDP would have fallen 3 times as much as it did. Employment is expected to rebound in the United States, and that we're expected to recover all jobs lost in the pandemic by this quarter. State and local governments finally began to be recognized for their role in abetting the pandemic and also their role in general in social reproduction in society. And aid was exceptional to state and local governments. In fact, 46 of the 50 states had surpluses of greater than 10% of their budgets in fiscal year 2021. And this is after decades, basically, of shortfalls. There are various indirect effects of the aid from the COVID crisis. For example, the bargaining power of workers tended to increase. Minimum wages were increased in 21 of the 50 states in 2021. Of course, there were some negative impacts with regard to state aid. Some recent studies, David Auteur's work and others are finding that some of the programs that were instituted, particularly Trump's Paycheck Protection Program, which gave cash or grants and loans to businesses for keeping the workforce on, employed, that only about 25% of the funding went directly to workers who would have lost jobs. And there are other things, other issues, that other inequalities, wealth inequality also increased during the COVID period, the current period. So the aid then tended to make up for lost ground for state and local government. The Biden White House notes that public domestic investment as a share of the US economy has fallen by more than 40% since the 1960s. And when currently a number of studies are looking at what counties and municipalities are doing with their aid, and most of them are using the new aid that comes in to make up for shortfalls and declines in revenue in the past, and as well as during the COVID crisis. So another point is that political partisanship touched everything, and this is particularly on the right, and it limited the state's ability to be transformative. For example, the CARES Act, the major act that was passed under Trump, was passed in part because 2020 was an election year, and the Republicans needed to show that they were doing something. Not one Republican voted for Biden's American Rescue Plan, but the subsequent $1 trillion infrastructure bill was bipartisan. And political partisanship touched everything from Trump delaying aid because he wanted to have his signature on checks that went to individuals. And normally Trump or the president would not have signed these checks. It would have just been like a bureaucrat, and those checks would have gone out very quickly. But Trump delayed the process by several days. So there was also a wide variation. So federalism, sorry, the next point here, federalism as it exists in the United States dampened the response and added to spatial inequality, particularly under Trump. Weak federal leadership and problematic information under Trump made it difficult for states to respond. And there was competition among states for basic things like personal protection items, vaccines, and there was wide variation in how states responded, and particularly between the rural and urban states, and then within states, rural and urban counties and localities. In the United States, it's important to note that the state level state plays a very important role in policies like dealing with COVID and basically basic health policies, and also like in economic development policies, and basically a range of policies. So turning to the other point, is this a break with the past? So I think we need to take stock in terms of what has been done for public well-being. Certainly state, so the state at large saved lives, reduced unemployment, and so forth. But what has not been done, race and ethnicity inequalities, according to race and ethnicity, class and wealth inequalities, inequality by gender, continue to persist, and some social groups suffered more than others during the COVID crisis and are still suffering. We have our social safety net is not very responsive to rapid economic decline. Our traditional programs like social welfare, the TANF program, we don't have the administrative capacity basically to gear up to handle really rapid declines. So for the most part, we're catching up for lost ground, and the new action of the state is really, is probably compatible with neoliberalism. We have to remember that there are different phases of neoliberalism, and that neoliberalism is not so much shrinking the state as it is maintaining the balance of class power and harnessing labor and disadvantaged populations in service to neoliberal growth. So, for example, the state may grow under neoliberalism, as we find in the United States in some cases. So, for example, the prison industrial complex, some of the communities that were getting aid from Biden's American Rescue Plan are using this, and the infrastructure program are using this to broaden the prisons that they have, in their states, and also the temporal issues that in terms of the transformation and being compatible with neoliberalism. There's emergency Keynesianism and short-run measures, and so basically to prop up the current status quo. And so although the state has intervened in the economy in very novel ways, it has done this largely to protect the current system that we have, and to maintain spatial inequality and uneven patterns of well-being. And the new action of the state, again, is particularly dependent upon the action of the state-level state. And 23 of our 50 states are entirely controlled by the Republican Party. That is their governorship and their Senate and their state House of Representatives. And so, this does not bode well really for the future. So the US state response does not suggest extensive transformation. There's a nice article by Usman Shohan in Policy and Society that runs through the criteria that we might want to see for real transformation. And it's not a critical juncture, and that it's not a fork in the road. The aid and the US state response was not a fork in the road where we can't go back. And it's not, argue not face lasting ideational displacement by Keynesianism. Still, to how this is my last slide. I'm not sure about the time. So how transformational. So I think the changes that the state has enacted conveys to the public some evidence that the state can be effective. There's some possibility that we're seeding the future for a future more interventionist state. So there are various policy networks now being established between progressive states and localities that are for example, one of them notes leaders are not content looking backward to rebuild a flawed system of the past, but rather are taking advantage of a unique moment to build a better and more prosperous future. So potentially there's some progress there. Underlying social problems became more visible in the United States. This is, we lack national health care coverage that is guaranteed for people. We lack family leave for people that's paid, lack income protections. And also in the same time period, we had issues like George Floyd's murder in Minnesota, national protest, all of this happening during the same time of the COVID crisis. And perhaps this, perhaps in terms of transformation, we have helped to develop a more state-supportive clientele. So turning to the last point here, are current gains sustainable? Likely doubtful. It's unclear right now, but possibly doubtful. The Republicans have been, already raising voices that too much is being spent on government and government aid to COVID, and things change quickly. But in the past few weeks, Republicans refused to give Biden any more aid for COVID, for direct COVID health programs, unless he can show where the dollars are going to come from, which is another way of saying that we need to cut programs if we're going to fund, basic health care. The chair of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, Florida Senator Rick Scott, has provided a blueprint for what Republicans will do if they get a majority in the next election, which is this next election in 2022 November. And he says socialism is the blueprint says socialism is un-American and always leads to poverty and oppression. We will stop it. We will shrink federal government, reduce the government workforce by 25% in 5 years, sell government buildings and assets, blah, blah, and so forth. So, I think, we have a long road ahead to changing, the view of the state in the United States. And Jamie Peck in a 2012 piece has a nice term called folk neoliberalism. And, basically the idea that the American population has bought into the neoliberal narrative. And we can see this in, cross-national studies that the US population has low trust in government relative to other high income nations, and we lead in deaths, and we lead in the lack of vaccinations. So, sort of going back to some of the things that Andrew mentioned earlier, I think we need, better understanding of the periodization of capitalism, and now we've gone through two different crises and different understandings of the spatial manifestations of these crises, and how spatial inequalities are tied into the maintenance of neoliberalism. I think we also need better understanding of how populist radical right parties govern, because this Keynesianism for their core voters, but nothing for anybody, for other people, for other constituents. And certainly we need to start looking more at power imbalances between different levels of the state, because in the United States, we have oftentimes the progressive cities and then the, basically the backwood states that are still mired in the traditional neoliberal tradition. So I'll stop there, but thank you. Look forward to your comments.
Thanks very much, Linda. That was a great presentation, excellent account of the US, and very complimentary to Adam's earlier presentation, I think, in lots of ways. So we'll now move seamlessly on to our third speaker, Kean van Lim. So Kean, over to you. The floor is all yours.
Right, a very good afternoon, everyone, and a rather good morning and good evening to you. Thank you very much for spending your afternoon with me at this session. So before I can speak, I would like to thank the organizing committee of the Regional Studies Association for inviting me, to Danny and to Sally for your kind invitation, and Katharina and Alex for facilitating this presentation. And also, I'm very happy to hear the presentations from Adam and Linda. I think they offer very interesting perspectives to which I hope to contribute an additional point of view that would hopefully stimulate an engaging conversation after the presentation. So today I'm going to talk about state capitalism as sovereignty accumulation nexus. The primary premise of these, to go straight into the motivation of the study, is that it's not that the state is proactively driving capital accumulation. I think in Adam's presentation and in a lot of literature that has emerged over the past decade, it is very clear that the state is very proactive in driving capital accumulation. And I think over the past few years, Adam's team at Maastricht University with Milan Babic, Elias Alami, and Imogen Liu, they have presented very compelling evidence that the state is, like I had mentioned earlier, is really increasingly more involved in the capital accumulation process. So today, I think the broader question that I would like to introduce is not that the state is proactively driving and engaged in capital accumulation, but why it is doing so. And for us to do so, I would like to propose taking a step back and to address a fundamental question. And so to address the fundamental question, and that is, what is the core function of a state? So that is my point of departure. So, in order to understand the state's role in state capitalism, we understand the capitalism aspect. I think, that we have immense amount of evidence that shows that the state is very active in capital accumulation, but then we need to take a step back to ask, what is the core function of a state? And I would like to propose these alternative, or maybe not alternative, but a point of view that allows us to reflect more critically on the role of a state and why it is participating in the capital accumulation process. For me, the point of departure here is that a state, the core function of a state is that it has to generate conditions that enable the reproduction of sovereignty. And it also seeks to preempt socio-political resistance. So sovereign rule for a state is its primary reason for existence. It has to ensure that it stays as a state. All right, so for a state, I think that's the key role, all right, that it has to play. And I think a lot of times in the state capitalism debate, this focus on sovereignty has been underplayed, and it is in some ways quite natural, but ironically, it is sovereignty, or rather the fear of the loss of sovereignty, I would argue, that leads to portrayals of state capitalism as an emerging threat. So for specific states that subscribe, right, to a particular ideology that, there must be less state, which is quite ironic, but, if they subscribe to such an ideology, right, it is the fear of the loss of their sovereignty that they portray state capitalism, right, as a threat. So I think the focus on sovereignty has to take, or rather, it needs to gain take a greater attention, amongst research on state capitalism. So a state has to generate conditions that enable itself to reproduce its existence. And capital accumulation and territorial reconfigurations are its primary methods. So here we are proposing, myself and my co-author, Xiaobo Su, we are contributing a paper to the special issue on making space for the new state capitalism that Adam introduced earlier, right, in Environment and Planning A. And we propose that the dynamic relationship between state sovereignty and capital accumulation is produced and sustained through territoriality. So territoriality, right, the use of territory for political, economic, and social ends, right, takes center stage, and in so doing, it enables the reproduction of state sovereignty and capital accumulation. And this relationship constitutes what we call the sovereignty accumulation nexus, which is the framework that we would like to introduce here. And hopefully, going by what Adam has mentioned earlier in his presentation, that the term state capitalism lacks a rubric, or rather lacks analytical purchase. We hope that we are inspired by the research that his team has been doing, and we hope that this particular framework, the sovereignty accumulation nexus, right, contributes to adding analytical purchase to the broader research on state capitalism. So this then leads on to the question: what is the sovereignty accumulation nexus? So let us look at state sovereignty. So the production of sovereign rule, so the indivisible and absolute rule by a state, right, is generally reproduced within and beyond state space. Generally, I think, for the social sciences, what John Agnew has talked about as the territorial trap, right? Generally, the feeling is that state sovereignty is reproduced within a particular state space, right? So it is territorially confined to state space. But actually, the production of states and production and reproduction of state sovereignty need not just be confined within state space. All right, it is reproduced both within and beyond state space. And this is why we need to understand the state's production and reproduction of sovereignty more as a systemic and global scale phenomenon. Right, and I think this applies to, in theory, all state, but especially in states that seek to assert its influence and sustain its sovereign power. All right, so it applies especially to the case of China, right, which I would talk about briefly in a moment. And capital accumulation, right, the process of capital accumulation, David Harvey has introduced this dialectic, so this is not novel, right? The process of capital accumulation evolves through a fundamental tension between capitalistic logics, which seeks reduced barriers to capital flows, and a territorial logic, which seeks to embed these flows. All right, so there is a fundamental tension in the process of capital accumulation. And I think, a lot of times scholars have looked at, the tension in capital accumulation in itself, all right? And then states are, they are not the central focal point, but I think in research on state capitalism, we need to bring the state's core role, which is it seeks to reproduce state sovereignty, and this particular tension together, because many a time, right, the reproduction, the process of reproducing state sovereignty is entwined, right, with the process of capital accumulation. And this leads us to a nexus, a connection, right, in that the reproduction of state sovereignty through capital accumulation, it entails negotiating this fundamental tension of capital accumulation. So for a state to reproduce its existence, all right, to sustain sovereign rule, all right, it needs to negotiate the fundamental tension of capital accumulation. And this leads to the framework that we're introducing in this forthcoming paper that hopefully will be published online later this month. And that is the sovereignty accumulation nexus as a framework. All right, the relationship between the state and capital connection, it becomes complicated because the state, all right, is at once simultaneously a part of transnational circulatory capital, right? As Adam mentioned in his presentation earlier, right, the state also owns capital. Right, so in that sense, right, the state is embedded within capital, right? So it is at once a part of transnational circulatory capital, and it also is a part of territorially based coalitions. All right, so it is also out of capital, and it is part of territorially based groups of actors that seek very actively to embed transnational circulatory capital. So this makes the whole relationship very complicated. All right, and I think this is the primary dynamic that drives state capitalism generically. All right, and it applies across, all right, different states. So if you very quickly look at the figure to your right, all right, territoriality is in the middle, all right, transnational circulatory capital is to the top, all right, and territoriality, all right, is driven and affected by the reproduction of state sovereignty. So the state very actively seeks to redefine and reconfigure dominant scales for accumulation, right, and in so doing, right, it embeds, but it also sorry, I can't see the my diagram. No, it also enhances and devalue, right, transnational circulatory capital. So the process of territoriality, right, is it embeds capital into specific territories, but and in so doing, it enhances and potentially it also devalues transnational circulatory capital. And this is a very dynamic process, all right, that then would affect, you know, the stability of state sovereignty. So in the primary motivation for states to behave in this way is that, you know, it seeks both reduced barriers to capital flows. It wants to embed transnational circulatory, it wants to reduce barriers to these flows so that, you know, it benefits the circulatory capital, all right, it enables them to flow relatively freely to places that they choose. Right, but yet it also seeks to enforce these barriers, right, to benefit from these flows. And in this case, right, this particularly apply to subnational economic actors, territorialized class alliances that would benefit from capturing transnational circulatory flows, right, and bringing them to particular locations, right, subnational regions especially. So these briefly constitute the sovereignty accumulation nexus that is presented in this presentation. I do not have much time to delve into the case, but in the paper, we talk about the sovereignty accumulation nexus in China. Very quickly, the Chinese case is very important, not just because it is construed, all right, in the global scale media, I mean, I wouldn't say universally, right, but in major English language publication, there is a general sense that, you know, it constitutes a threat, right, to a particular nation state. So, I mean, here there is a sense of an erosion of sovereignty, right, at play. But so in that sense, the fear of Chinese state capitalism is makes the Chinese case itself worth exploring. But I think what is more interesting about the Chinese case is that it shows how the sovereignty accumulation nexus works. And it enables us to not just look at what is happening within China, but how it actually is interconnected with the global system of capitalism. So for us briefly to understand this, all right, we need to understand what's happening within China and what is the core goal of the current ruling Communist Party of China, which has been in power since the establishment of a new Chinese state in 1949. And briefly put, the core goal of the ruling Communist Party of China is that it needs to enjoy perpetual rule. So it is one of the four cardinal principles of that it has established, right? So its goal is that it has to enjoy perpetual rule. So this is the goal of a party, right? And the unique and interesting thing here is that party survival, right, in China is the precondition of sovereign state rule. So this makes China distinct, right, from many states worldwide, because state rule, I mean, there could be changes in ruling parties, but state rule generally is assumed to be stable. Right, this itself is debatable. Right, states, as we know, are inherently unstable. Right, but in the Chinese context, party survival is the precondition of sovereign state rule. So the party, all right, the ruling party is very concerned and always actively trying, all right, to implement policies to preempt any kind of resistance and challenges, all right, to its rule. All right, and at the same time, it is participating, especially over the past 40 years, participating actively, right, in the global economy. Yeah, so it explains the proactive territorial reconfiguration within and increasingly beyond Chinese state space. So there's very, very proactive territorial reconfiguration, and some examples that are presented here in this slide are subnational spatial strategies, economic statecraft, and direct accumulation. So we have special economic zones. All right, that's a subnational at a subnational scale, nationally strategic new areas, and at the global level, in terms of economic statecraft, we have the Go Abroad program, RMB internationalization, made in China 2025, and I think for many people, for many members of the audience, the Belt and Road Initiative. So all these are attempts, right, to reconfigure territories, to enhance, to create spaces for capital accumulation, to benefit transnational circulatory capital, and yet also enable territorialized coalitions to benefit. And in so doing, right, it sustained the power of the Chinese, the ruling Communist Party of China. So it is a very temporary process, so regularly, albeit temporarily resolving or easing the tensions in capital accumulation, right, is fundamental to sustained party state rule. So I haven't got much time to delve into the case study, but I hope we can follow up on this or send me a message later, and I'll provide more information on an upcoming publication on these in Environment and Planning A, which I've introduced earlier. So to conclude today's presentation, I would like to offer two questions that potentially could lead to new directions and which hopefully will open up the floor for discussion. And that is, how is the sovereignty accumulation nexus expressed across the global system of states? All right, so if the quest for sovereignty is universal for states, right, how is the sovereignty accumulation nexus then expressed, right, at the global level across different states? And the second question is that how do these expressions then collectively, right, how do they come together to reproduce what is called, what is now, I think, what Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore has called the variegated system of capitalism. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kean. That was great presentation, and particularly drawing out the importance of sovereignty and sovereignty accumulation nexus. So I think we've had three very stimulating and distinctive, but hopefully complementary presentations that I think illuminate very nicely different aspects and approaches to this question of new state capitalism. So at this point, we open the floor up for questions. So either, as I said earlier, put your question in the chat with a Q before, or raise your hand if you've got your camera on. Maybe while people are thinking up questions and processing all that they've heard, I might just kick things off. I was kind of interested in the speakers' different particular kind of understandings of kind of what's almost driving these dynamics of state capitalism, state expansion, if that's indeed what we're seeing. Adam, I think you had these kind of two long-term secular processes, which I think were kind of digitization and industrial overcapacity. I wonder if you might just want to maybe say a little bit more about these and how you see them as driving the the expansion of the response, the expansion of the state, or shaping that process.
Right, thanks. So, yeah, I mean, so when we were trying to understand, why now, that's the question we got to. And we wanted an explanation that was global in scope. Because many of them, you in the literature, a lot of, you would see tautological arguments, right? So there'd be arguments that would say, X country has large amounts of state-owned enterprises or sovereign wealth funds, and that makes it state capitalist. It's state capitalist because it has large-scale, state ownership, right? And so it just kind of goes in this thing, and it didn't really give us a global explanation. But because, and this was, what was emphasized by Kean, is that, in our initial work, we found that a lot of the literature failed to have a theory of the state. What is it that states do? It just kind of was there, or it was in a very much a Weberian, looking just at the bureaucrats, but not really in a sense of what is the state there for and what does it do and why. So we needed a theory of the state. And so then we wanted to put that into in the context of how do states react to changing global conditions and the changing transformation of global capitalism. And so I think most people in the regional studies crowd, geographers, understand very well the crisis tendencies, but also the massive shifts in regional restructuring, regional growth, but also regional decline. So and how this is played out on a global scale. So just to kind of, one of the points that was drawn is, how can we draw out state capitalism and make it useful or relevant to those that are specifically focused to regional studies. And I would say that regional studies is probably one of the best, or those that do regional work is one of the best means of understanding state capitalism, because we're interested in uneven and combined development, right? So I think a lot of the, let's say, national level, methodologically nationalist literature in the social sciences by nature tends to be just focuses on the national scale, and that doesn't allow us to and I think most would agree here that it doesn't provide an adequate explanation for capitalist restructuring, and at least on the ground. So in short, I think there's a lot of relevance for regional studies in explaining, let's say, the global to local and the different kind of unfolding of uneven and combined development, and how states are, through these state capitalist impulses, are reacting to these and mediating these transformations. So yes, going to your questions, we looked at them. We wanted to understand the secular capitalist transformations, what has changed in the nature of capitalism recently in the last 20 years or longer. And on the one hand, it would be automation, robotization, the digitalization of large scale industry, which has had so many effects on labor, particularly in the advanced capitalist economies, but it's having effects elsewhere as well. And this has transformed capitalism, I think, in profound ways. And on the other hand, the other secular stagnation issue, and we see this, across the advanced capitalist economies, but elsewhere too, is this the mismatch between capital and labor, and capital is winning and labor has not gotten a pay rise in years, and how is this mediating and the politically, and how are states reacting to it? And then we wanted to understand the geographical manifestations of both these secular transformations. And we know that automation, robotization, but also these changing, deepening divisions of the new international division of labor. And this has changed patterns of global production and consumption. But it's also offered many countries, particularly resource-rich countries, to accumulate more wealth. So in the Middle East, but countries like Norway, those with significant mining resources. And so it's changed, and that's altered global financial markets, because it's allowed certain countries to accumulate wealth, which then allows them to plug into global finance in ways that are really interesting, which they couldn't do before. And then, on the issue of secular stagnation, the geographical manifestations of this, and again, this audience is very well aware of this, and very much is at the heart of what a lot of regional studies do, is understanding regional growth in different parts of the world, but also regional decline and how these play out. And so I think state capitalism has a lot of, there's a lot of, I think, promise for regional studies, in particular in helping us link up, because again, we're interested in the interactions across regions and globally, and how states and the transnational state activity is involved in this. I know it was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that was helpful. Yeah,
no, thanks very much, Adam. You covered a lot there and brought several dimensions of your argument there. Kean, I wonder if I think you presented a really kind of compelling model, bringing sovereignty in, and the sovereignty, the kind of anchored sovereignty versus that kind of transnational circulatory capital. I was always wondering how the Belt and something like the Belt and Road Initiative might fit in that framework, almost as maybe in a kind of more empirical illustration. I mean, does something like that and these infrastructure initiatives we're seeing, do they kind of embody that nexus you're talking about in a way?
Yes. So in the paper, we mentioned briefly about the role of the Belt and Road, but we see the Belt and Road as an extension of attempts at territoriality. So not in the traditional sense of colonization or territorial conquests, but to create via economic statecraft a variety of measures, right, to enable surplus capital from China to be extended. And in that sense, right, it eases the tensions that are confronting specific actors within China, and that is the generally well-researched phenomenon of overcapacity and overaccumulation in China. So there is a need to address these particular issues. So the Belt and Road, in that sense, and I think maybe members of the audience may disagree, but that in relation to the framework, right, is an extension of, or rather is an expression, right, of these nexus in the sense that it enables the Chinese state to ease, all right, the tensions that are generated by over capacity and over accumulation. So there is a need to find new outlets and create new territories that are able to absorb this capital. All right, so it has met a lot of resistance, but I think viewed in relation to that framework, it is part of what Adam has mentioned. I mean, we have to look at this from a global level, right? So enable us to look at the reproduction of Chinese state sovereignty via these specific territorial strategies, right, to ease the tension between capitalistic logics and territorial logics.
Thanks, Kean. Yeah, that's really interesting. Linda, I mean, obviously the US is a distinctive case, but it seems the kind of politics of the partisan politics of the state are driving here. But I'm getting a sense that you feel that the kind of neoliberalism and the forces against the state are kind of politically more influential or more than the political forces perhaps pushing for an expansion of the state?
Well, in the U.S. case, the forces, the way that I would say that characterize like the current political environment is the forces that are pushing back against the state, trying to shrink the state, are growing. And I know this is more empirically oriented than the two other presenters. But the case of the United States, I think, really is distinct, and I think I've never really thought so seriously about partisanship and its influence on the state. But it's in your face in the United States, and as a researcher, you see the impact of partisanship. So I think that is really driving the momentum currently that we see in the United States. And the future is very uncertain because it seems to be quite clear that Republicans get in 2020, there's going to be more of a rollback. And these gains, it took US local government employment between the recession years until 2019 to recover. that the same amount of employment. So just basically right before the pandemic, we recovered state and local government employment. It had shrunk so much. And I like to look at state and local government employment because I think it's probably a more adequate measure of the state itself than spending, because spending can go to, we privatize everything we can in the United States. And so state employment is very, very important. So I think that yes, to me right now, currently, I'm looking at partisanship and how that is driving the momentum of what the US state is doing.
Great, thanks, Linda. That comes out very strongly. We have some questions in the chat. So a question from Dimitri Korpakis asking really what kind of geopolitical risks are potentially generated by the return of state capitalism and its scaling up, and how can this shape a new world order? I mean, perhaps the geopolitical element wasn't foremost in a lot of the presentations, but it's probably, in the current context, it's probably a bit inescapable in talking about state capitalism, obviously, what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, but also, I mean, the wider, almost, I guess, rivalries between state capitalisms. I don't know, Adam, could you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think on the one hand, what we've tried to do is to temper some of the discussion around the rivalry in terms of, let's say, othering China as being this rogue state capitalist political economy, because we think that that ignores so much of the state capitalism we see in the West, in advanced capitalist economies, even the United States. I mean, I think if you look at the defense spending, there's not state ownership per se in the United States, but there's significant, US industrial policy is done through the defense budget, right? And it's such a huge part of spending that you think, well, how is that any different than what China is doing as a state? I mean, it comes in different forms, but we want to move away from this pure free market liberal model versus this Chinese state capitalist model, because on the one hand, that reinforces a world that is defined by methodological nationalism, which we find problematic as geographers, and prevents us from seeing the transnational linkages and ties and the interreferentiality. But at the same time, what we've argued is that state capitalism begets state capitalism, and so the geopolitical, or if you like, the geoeconomic tensions are growing, and we already see this with increases in investment screening regulations in Europe and the United States and around the world. And much of this is a response to the rise of China, and the arguments therein are often that, well, there's an unfair, unlevel playing field because of Chinese state ownership or subsidies. So that's the geopolitical, I think, risks that happening. But at the same time, the other thing to be careful about in the state capitalism debate is, again, and Lyndon mentioned this as well, is that we're not saying that this means non-market or sort of neoliberalism is still there, a framing of the market. I mean, the state capital hybrids that we're interested in, they're very much marketized and corporatized. They're for profit. And so for most, contemporary 21st century state capitalists, if you like, they want markets to work, and they want to unlock the barriers to capital accumulation at home and abroad. So I think there's limits to how much, geopolitical, geoeconomic kind of tensions will prevent things. But obviously, I mean, the Russia-Ukraine thing shows that markets are still, we can close them. But yeah, so I think that's what I would say to that.
Thanks, Adam. That's a good response. Any of the other speakers want to come in on that question? Okay, we have some other questions in the chat. So a couple of questions from Paulo Balmas, one for Adam. Is it possible to identify the geographies of the four impulses of state capitalism, in the sense that in one country, one impulse may prevail over others? Is there a correlation between the four impulses and how banking systems are organized?
Yes, so thanks, Paolo. I mean, I think what I should have mentioned is that these four impulses that we've identified, they're not limited to those. Those were the four that we kind of thought of. We can think of additional ones potentially, but it's really an empirical question. I don't think that these impulses that we talk about in the paper are you can only have one at one time, or I think it's more of a conceptual device for explaining what we're seeing in different places. So I think that it's really contingent on the case that you're looking at.
Paulo also has a question for Kean. Concerning that 50% of Chinese exports belong to foreign companies, how would you explain the role of the Chinese Communist Party, and presuming CPC, in assuring the reproduction of foreign state sovereignty? So almost foreign investors, US, Japanese, German, for example, and capital accumulation on its own territory. So the role of the Chinese state and party in reproducing foreign state capitals or foreign capitals on its own territory.
Yeah. Thanks, Paulo, for the question. I think in the short term, there is no explicit need for an assurance in a sense, because the entwinement is very beneficial for the Chinese state. So in writing the paper, we reflected on these as well in terms of the foreign capital investments in China. And looking at the statistics for 2018, the combination of foreign and domestic companies accounted for 87% of urban employment in China, which is where a lot of industrial production is taking place. So this comes from a McKinsey consulting report. And these 87% of urban employment is up from 18% in 1995. So there is a huge increase in terms of the share of non-state capital, both foreign and domestic, right, in urban employment. And so in that sense, if foreign capital is driven out of China, then it will have a direct impact, at least in the short term, on urban employment. So in that sense, it works well in terms of ensuring the stability of Chinese state rule, to ensure that urban employment is not adversely affected, especially given our current context with the pandemic over the past 2 years. It is even more important that there is stable employment figures. So going forward, obviously, there are new strategies to increase the capacities of domestic firms and maybe not explicitly, but to reduce reliance on foreign investments. But this is a medium to longer term strategy. But in the short term, foreign production in China is very important in terms of its contribution to direct employment in cities. So it's 87% overall, together with domestic non-state firms. So these play very important roles, right, in terms of ensuring social stability. And if I could add an additional statistic that was reported recently in the Financial Times, right, and this is very interesting. Even after the pandemic happened, the global exposures, so global investors' interests and purchases of stocks and bonds in China has increased to US $1.1 trillion. All right, this is up 5 times from 2014. So there is even more exposure globally, all right, to Chinese stocks and bonds, which again tell us about a very strong interconnection between what is happening within China and the interests of economic actors, all right, beyond China. So here we are talking about a very interconnected world, right, where China and economic actors from other parts of the world would have to be viewed as a more systemic global scale entity rather than just what's happening within China. So this is a great question, and it enables us to reflect more critically on what is actually happening on the ground and what are the interests of economic actors involved in the capital accumulation process, right? What the state stands to gain, right, from catering to the interests of these actors, and in turn, enable itself to sustain stable rule. But thank you very much for that question.
Thanks, Kean. We have a question from Theodora de Gara to all the panelists. Could the panelists please also reflect on the evolving position and role of institutions in the present discussion on state capitalism? So, I mean, Linda, would you have any perspective?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it depends upon what what institutions mean. Whether that means capital labor relations that are established through unions or what. But I mean, yeah, in the story of the United States response to the COVID crisis, and again, I realize I'm dealing with sort of a narrow slice of state. It's probably not state capitalism per se, but it's basically the state's involvement in reproduction. Institutions were key to the response. The failure of institutions at the federal level, like under Trump. We go on and on about variations in terms of the state level state and local versus state level entities, and basically a lot at the state level. A lot of the states are trying to preempt local governments from responding in progressive ways, and trying to cut, we use the term preemption's increasing, so regulating the ability of local governments to regulate different economic activities on their territories, such as regulating the extraction of gas and oil, and so institutions go on and on. So, or the institutional part of this goes on and on in the case of the United States. But in the case of the COVID crisis, it was basically the states trying to constrain localities, particularly the cities, from enacting more stringent health measures. And so, I think, but beyond COVID, this is we have an immense amount of tension in the United States between federal government, state government, and then local governments within states. So very much a story of, I think, institutions, and then on the other hand, having weak labor, we have weak bargaining power of workers because unionization rates are so low. And so on the other hand, there's these institutions that might correct for some of these problems are not there very much anymore in the United States.
Thanks, Linda. Adam, did you have any response to that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, again, what we mean by institutions. So there is a quite large literature that we've critiqued from the comparative capitalism school, or the kind of comparative political economy, which tries to define an ideal type state capitalist political economy. But this often, I think this literature is useful in certain respects, in that it does make us aware of the role of institutions. And I'm referring to institutions in the context of varieties of capitalism type framing. But often this is there's quite a bit of weaknesses in this particular literature, and defining it's quite arbitrary and saying, well, this is state capitalist and not, because they'll take a form of an institution, and not realizing that multiple forms can also have similar functions. And so I think there's definitely room to develop institutional thinking on state capitalism, particularly in doing comparative work. But we would caution on trying to define an ideal type state capitalist political economy. And again, the example I gave of U.S. defense spending is a kind of a classic example of of, well, the US isn't like state capitalist China, but it has in many functional terms things that would put it in a category that makes such comparisons more difficult.
Thanks. Kean, did you have any thoughts on institutions?
Yeah, I think it's quite apparent, given the focus on sovereignty, that institutions are important, especially with regard to state institutions. And I think these pertain, I wouldn't risk universalizing here, but I would think that, in where state sovereignty is concerned, with regard to every individual state, and I would probably venture as far as saying that this applies also to the United States, in that, if sovereignty is crucial, right, for the reproduction of a state's existence, then institutions matter. The question is what the institutions do, right, whether they engage directly in capital accumulation or whether they try to facilitate capital accumulation. But either way, they have to work to address the fundamental tensions that exist between the capitalistic logic and the territorial logic that David Harvey has identified. So in that sense, institutions are actually fundamental, to this entire process. And but I know I'm speaking generally here. So the broader questions is, what kinds of institutions? Are they military institutions, or are they more economic or economically oriented institutions, or pro-capital accumulation institutions? But here we can look at specific types of institutions, but generically, I think institutions are fundamental, to the process of state capitalism, because they are necessary for the reproduction of the state apparatus and the relevance of the state apparatus in sustaining its existence.
Thanks, Kean. I think we have a nice question in the chat from Lou Sigao on China Academy of Sciences. A question for Adam and Kean. When you talk new state capitalism, since when has it been new? When did it start, if you like? 2008 global economic crisis or COVID-19? I think the new may have been a little bit imposed by me on the state capitalism debate, perhaps to dramatize it. Adam, I think you kind of talked about expansion.
But I think new, because we certainly use it in our discussions, but so the new is, on the one hand, recognizing that there is an older literature that utilizes state capitalism, right? So, and there's some really good work by someone named Nathan Sperber that looks at the genealogy of the term and its historical usage. The new for us is the increase, on the one hand, in the discourse around state capitalism in the academic literature, but also the business and talking head, the media, which utilizes it most often with China, but for other countries. And that started, including this literature, in and around the mid 2000s. I would say it started to become more prominent, and then increasingly so in the last decade after the global financial crisis. So on the discursive side, it's this new is the new usage of this concept, which was a driver for us to say, well, what do we mean by state capitalism? Everyone's using it now, and but then the new in the material sense is the appearance of increasing amounts of sovereign wealth funds, the growth rather than the decline of state-owned enterprises in a globalized, neoliberalized world economy. The rebirth, as I mentioned earlier, about industrial policy and more kind of explicit forms of state intervention. And so that's the new, and the periodization of this, I would say, is very much in the last 10 years. But in terms of periodization, that's where it's important for us. We make this case in the initial paper we wrote in Competition and Change, is that a lot of the literature was not historically grounded. And it's important that we look and see, well, what is new about sovereign wealth funds existing or state-owned enterprises, because we've had these in the past. But at the same time, we do see organizational transformations, right? So, I mean, state-owned enterprises of today operate very differently than the kind of what we would think of as a state-owned enterprise, very much in a planning model of previous generations. They're more marketized and neoliberalized in ways that I think make them new. So I'll leave it at that. But Kean, maybe we have something to add.
Yeah, my perception of what is new from your paper, I mean, the very influential paper with Elias in political geography is very much the same. So, I mean, at one level, it is very much a discursive presentation or representation of state capitalism, especially in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, where we see a very strong response internationally from China, which captured a lot of the headlines in terms of the role of the state. But I think in part, I was questioning, we were questioning that in the Environment and Planning A paper, because historically, China has always been involved in the capital accumulation process. It's not just after 2008. So in the material sense, what is actually new and what is happening in China is more proactive outward expansion and reconfiguration of territories beyond what was their or rather in contrast to their prior approach before 2008. So it is very much more explicit global scale expansion. So you see programs that were introduced previously, like Go Abroad, being brought back into the fold after 2008. Then you have RMB internationalization, and then a few years later, you have the Belt and Road Initiative and Made in China 2025. So if there is anything new, it would be more of these territorial expressions of how the Chinese state is trying to reconfigure its involvement in the capital accumulation process, right? In a more proactive way and at the global level that was not previously seen, all right, after the formation of the Chinese state in 1949. But even so, in taking a historical approach, if you look at, or rather when the paper is out, maybe, readers might have a better idea, but, when the Chinese state was formed in 1949, it was actually immediately internationalized into the so-called socialist world economy led by the USSR. So it had to participate in that socialist world economy right from the beginning. So we could argue that, even at that stage, China was not insulated. I mean, it was part of that that world economy, and there was a particular system led by the USSR, and so there's some degree of historical continuity. It's just that the territorial expression evolved and changed. So if there's anything new, and that's our argument in the paper in Environment and Planning A, it would be this evolution, right? And the focus on territoriality would enable us to see this evolution, not in terms of the newness that is being presented in the media, that China constitutes a threat to the national system. I think, ironically, like I said, it actually represents an expression of sovereignty on the part of fear of those who believe that state capitalism is a threat, and China specifically constitutes a threat because this also speaks to a fear of a loss of sovereignty.
Thanks, Kean and Adam. Great answers. So we're now out of time for this part of the session. So I just really want to thank the three speakers again for some great presentations and very wide-ranging answers to questions, and also for the audience for coming along and listening, answering questions. It's now time for me to hand over to Sally Hardy, the Chief Executive of the Regional Studies Association, to offer some official words of closure, I think, for the festival.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you to all the speakers, Adam, Linda, and Kean. That was absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed it, and I thought the discussion at the end was, it was a really great way to wrap up what's been a very enjoyable fortnight of festivaling. So yeah, this is the second Global E-Festival that we've run. And you will all know that it's born out of the necessity to move on from face-to-face, the abandonment of face-to-face events caused by the pandemic. It has been a huge success, and in a second I'll just give you some of the figures. But to let you know that we're moving back to face-to-face events, hurrah! In September with the Central and East European Conference, and I think my colleagues are going to put some of the links in the chat. That will be held in Leipzig in Germany.
Then we're in October, we're at the European Commission running the University Open Days, Regions Week, and Masterclass. We will be launching a new activity this year with the Commissioner for Regional Policy, Elisa Ferreira. So if you have students or early career researchers in your departments that are looking at things related to cohesion policy, look out for announcements. We're offering 1.5-day seminars in Brussels with a 2-hour slot with the Commissioner. It's an amazing opportunity, and it's come from the Commissioner's office. So fantastic opportunity for the field. Our winter conference returns in November to London on regions in transition, looking at economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And I, for one, cannot wait. I cannot wait to see everybody. So I'm going before then in June with some of my colleagues to the Economic Geography Conference in Dublin, where the RSA is powering the kind of the back office function around the programme. So I really hope to see quite a few of you there, and I'm sure I'll be standing by the bar, gratefully buying drinks just for the opportunity to chat when we're there. So the E-Festival. Well over 500 participants, 58 countries, almost 1,400 session logins, an average of 22 participants per session. That is fractionally down. I think it was 24 or 25 last year, which if you consider that we were all in lockdown when we ran last year and everybody's back teaching this year, it's an amazing tribute to the dedication of researchers desperate to watch. We of course record. When we started recording, we thought it would probably be a waste of my colleague Alex's time. Actually, that has been so far from the case. People do come in droves to watch the recordings. Over 300 views of recordings already from the last 2 weeks. And we know that that will go up quite steeply. Almost balanced gender representation at this event, as it was at the last event. And strong representation from emerging economies, 15% of the people here this time emerging economies. Student and early career participation was 34% before we started this. It's now dropped to 17%. And we think that's because the mid-career researchers have been picking up on the sessions on Twitter and LinkedIn and have been registering. So the numbers have been changing all the way through. So we started running this where speakers pay a very small fee, but it's absolutely free for people to attend, listen and participate in the debate. And that was a deliberate policy by the RSA board to be more inclusive and to make an offer to the global community. That has really worked again this year, and I really hope that the board will consider how we continue to make this offer through hybrid and blended events once we go back to face-to-face. Now, I have, before I come to the thank yous and close, I just need to award 3 prizes, and Alex is going to share the screen. And these are the photo competition that we run. So the first photo is the finalists for the award. This is a photo of your region. And then if we move to the first prize winner, this is Heike Meyer from the University of Bern in Switzerland. And all of our prize winners will win a book from the Regional Studies, Regions and Cities series. Our second prize winner, I really loved this because this says conference to me. It says talking to people, catching up, having a coffee, sunshine, hopefully. And this is from Efthymios Spiridon Georgiou from Greece. And then the final winner, who put in several entries, but this one was a winner, is Rui Marquez Pinto from Germany. And I just really loved the mixed architecture and the ivy. Yeah, I thought the judges did really well when they chose that. So let me now finish, thank you, Alex. Let me now finish with some thank yous. So I would like to thank warmly everybody that's spoken over the last fortnight, everybody that has volunteered or been volunteered to chair, especially maybe the people who've been volunteered. all the people who've acted as rapporteurs and facilitators, who've hosted the networking sessions, thank you. You are wonderful. Without you, there is no Regional Studies Association. I'd like to thank the RSA board. I think they've been courageous and ambitious as they've coped with the trauma of the lockdowns, the pivot away from face-to-face, a complete change in the way in which we do our business. That has not been easy, and they have stepped up magnificently. And I'm really proud of what we've achieved over the last 2 years. I'd like to thank the drivers of the RSA camper van from our event logo, which you can see in the picture under Alex's face. So this is a van that has virtually travelled around the world several times over the last fortnight. And of course, the drivers of that van are the RSA staff team. You are simply amazing. And I really want to credit your dedication to the field, your can-do attitude, your hard work and imagination. We're really lucky to have you all. Thank you very much for what you do for us all year, but thank you for the last fortnight. And then finally, I want to thank everybody that's come. So all the people who have turned up, taken time out of their day to listen to the papers, to give feedback on the papers, to enter the debate, to be an active part of the association. You are absolutely magnificent. Thank you so much. And I see Katerina has just popped up live. My final thank you is to Katerina, who has masterminded the whole event this year, a massive task, way over 200 papers, loads of parallel sessions. Thank you, Katerina, you've done us proud. And then I say to you all, join us at one of our events in this autumn, or come to Slovenia with us in June next year when we have our first annual conference in 3 years. So thank you very much. And I now close this second Global E-Festival. Thank you all.